But if I am who I say I am...
Well, that would probably be very intimidating if I weren't an atheist.
You ignorant sack of meat.
I know you are, but what am I?
Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. A little while back, after being inundated with ads on social media for it, I decided to do a review of a Christian anthology film called God's Not Here. And I just found out that director Matthew Cicchella is prepping to shoot the sequel to that film, so you can guarantee I'll review it when it drops. Now obviously a film review is a little different from my usual content, but you all seem to enjoy it, so I decided to do another one. And so I give you the Christian independent psychological horror film Nefarious, which had its limited release in April of this year and is now available on streaming sites. Now before we dive in, I have to admit that when I first saw the trailer for this film, I was kind of excited to see it, and for a whole host of reasons. It was billed as a psychological horror, which as many of you know is right smack in the middle of my wheelhouse. Thematically, it's essentially Fallen, which is one of the most underrated films in Denzel Washington's filmography, meets Law-Abiding Citizen, a fun, vicarious action revenge thriller starring Gerard Butler and Jamie Foxx. The film stars Sean Patrick Flanery, one of my all-time favorite indie actors, not just for the Boondock Saints, but going all the way back to the young Indiana Jones Chronicles. It also features Jordan Belfi, who many will recognize from playing Jeremy Piven's nemesis Adam Davies on the show Entourage. Belfi has also popped up in a number of my favorite TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Grey's Anatomy, Burn Notice, among many others. The film was predominantly shot in Oklahoma City, and it even used the Oklahoma State Reformatory in Granite, which is about 4 hours from where I am, and for a semi-max state prison has incredible cinematic appeal. Not to mention that the exterior of the prison is a wasteland of scrub brush, dirt, and rattlesnakes, and possesses a near biblical sense of isolated desolation which really lends itself to the theme of the movie. The film is a basic two-hander, meaning two leads, which I always personally enjoy, both as a member of the audience for the great performances they can deliver, and as an actor because these types of performances are always incredibly exciting because of the prospect of working the narrative in close proximity with another actor and with limited distractions.
Hey, it's fucking distracting having somebody walking up behind Bryce in the middle of the fucking scene.
Christian, I told you once before, it was not me that walked into your eye line, it was the goddamn grip. Now don't yell at me, man. I'm over here working on my own shit.
Oh, good for you. And how was it?
Dude, this is so fucking unprofessional. You just... I also really enjoy these types of films because they have the potential to showcase to the audience the absolutely demanding give and take relationship required between the actors, and they often live or die on the chemistry and creative instincts of the leads. And the big plus is that the entire theme of the movie is exactly what I cover right here on this channel, the arguments and claims that theists make. And it was made all the sweeter when apologists and Christian TikTok alike went completely batshit with clip reactions when the film dropped. So even before going in, needless to say, I was really hyped to see Nefarious when I first heard about it. However, because I simply can't seem to leave well enough alone, my excitement was tempered quite a bit when I decided to do a deep dive into the background of the production of the film. That brings us to this individual, Steve Deese. Steve Deese is a conservative activist, author, and talk show host whose show, The Steve Deese Show, is platformed by Blaze Media. He's built a kind of name for himself as the spokesperson for conspiratorial thinking regarding the 2020 election and the focus of the conservative Christian movement. But he's especially well known for his railings against America's pandemic response, or what he called the Fourth Reich. Deese also wrote the novel A Nefarious Plot, which is ostensibly the Screwtape Letters by way of the Proud Boys, which the film Nefarious is adapted from, and its sequel A Nefarious Carol, which continues following the adventures of the titular demon Nefarious as it plans to undermine and eventually destroy humanity just to spite God. Even though Nefarious openly admits numerous times that God is both omnipotent and omniscient, which of course logically entails that Satan's, and by extension its own plans for for the undermining and destruction of humanity are completely self-defeating, thus implying that all of the evil that we experience here on this planet, such as these demons running around trying to manipulate, undermine, and destroy us, is completely subjective, entirely intentional, and completely falsifies the idea that the God is omnibenevolent, but we will get to that broken logic later. So suffice to say, while the mind behind the source material is pretty extreme in his own right, I then found out that it was none other than Chuck Konzelman and Carrie Solomon who not only co-wrote the screenplay, but also co-directed the film. For those not entirely familiar with these two, they grew up childhood friends and have gone on to write and produce films like the philosophically bankrupt and intellectually dishonest God's Not Dead franchise, the absurdly overwrought and woefully deceptive abortion drama Unplanned, the atrociously saccharine sweet faith film Do You Believe, which sadly starred Sean Astin.
Oh, Sam.
And a host of other masturbatory Pureflix vehicles for Kevin Sorbo. And not least of all, Glenn Beck actually appears in the film as himself, showing up only in the denouement to solemnly interview Belfie's Dr. James Martin about his apparent conversion after the events of the film. And that was where I really found that the production kind of tips its hand. Because seeing as how Glenn Beck is the founder of Blaze Media, which hosts the Sourcebook Authors Talk Show, co-writer-director Carrie Solomon is the CEO of Believe Entertainment Group, which produced the film, and Believe Entertainment Group is partially owned by Trilith Studios, formerly Pinewood Atlanta, which is owned by the family trust of Dan Cathy, the homophobic former CEO of Chick-fil-A, we start to get a real sense of the driving ideology behind the film, and I can assure you, it ain't a religious one. Truly, the market size for selling Christians their validation is ridiculous. And bearing that in mind, it also has to be mentioned that at one point, production on Nefarious was halted due to a strike, as around 40 workers walked off set and picketed to get the production company, Nefarious Films LLC, to recognize IATSE, the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, as a collective bargaining agent for the crew. And all because the production company thought that by filming in Oklahoma and making use of the Filmed in Oklahoma incentive program would allow them to deny their unionized workers a union contract. But hey, just because there are some cringy minds and some financial shenanigans above the line doesn't necessarily mean that the film itself is all that bad, right?
And now you will learn what it means to be a fool!
So the film starts off in the office of Dr. Alan Fisher, played with a quiet solemnity by Mark de Alessandro, who appears to be wrapping things up for the day. And apparently Dr. Fisher is having an issue with his interior design, as he constantly finds himself having to re-level his framed psychiatry doctorate on the wall. Now this particular moment works twofold, because it sets up the idea that there is something ominous at work in Dr. Fisher's life, and by focusing so much on the degree itself, it expresses the filmmaker's oft-spouted personal disdain for the field of psychology, which makes sense given that the majority of the abuse suffered at the hands of the Christian faith is of a psychological nature, so psychologists pointing this out as a flaw in the faith makes them a natural enemy. So after a few more moments of tension building and some more picture shenanigans that the good doctor doesn't witness, Fisher enters the elevator and leaves the floor, only to suddenly appear outside the window to his office, screaming as he falls to his death, in which afterwards the ominous power in the room then inexplicably straightens the framed degree as if to cover up any evidence of its involvement. And I feel it's this particular moment that telegraphs the kind of logic that this film will be working with from here on out. An ominous unseen power messes with stuff just to needle us, even when we're not there to be needled, and then covers the tracks of its innocuous involvement even though it ostensibly would know that no investigator would assume its involvement in the first place. It's a decision so narratively pointless that the only point it serves is to foreshadow the narcissistic short-sightedness of the titular antagonist, while exposing the narcissistic short-sightedness of the filmmakers themselves. Next, we have Belfie psychiatrist Dr. James Martin arriving at Oklahoma State Reformatory for an emergency session with convicted serial killer Edward Wayne Brady. Warden Tom Moss, played with a gruff but folksy heavy-handedness by Criminal Minds actor Tom Omer, greets Martin and proceeds to trump up this notorious murderer as a criminal genius and master manipulator. Sort of like Seven's John Doe meets Aaron Stampler with a splash of the Joker just to round things out. Edward is currently set to be executed that night, but his sudden admission that he's possessed by a demon has thrown his mental competency into question. And seeing as how the state of Oklahoma does not put the mentally incompetent to death, Dr. Martin is brought in to assess Edward's capacity and determine if he's faking it all to get a last-minute reprieve, or if his cheese has legitimately slid off his cracker. The warden then pointedly makes the ethically questionable suggestion that it would be in the best interest of the victims and justice itself if the good doctor would expediently sign off on Edward's competency. But, in keeping with the contradictory fashion that this entire film is shrouded in, all of the warden's expository dialogue is tinted with a begrudging annoyance, as his dialogue deliberately mirrors the filmmakers' oft-publicly expressed dismay with what they see as a broken government system that works harder to safeguard the rights of monstrous individuals in its custody than those of general society. It's then revealed that Dr. Fisher is there because the original psychologist that was handling Edward's case is, you guessed it, the now deceased Dr. Fisher. Dr. Martin soon enters into a large visiting area where Edward is currently shackled to a center table awaiting the doctor's arrival, and this is not the last time that we will get the sense that Conzelman and Solomon really loved F. Gary Gray's law-abiding citizen either. Edward then proceeds to set the table with a strong volley, asserting his intellectual dominance by rattling off every professional detail of Dr. Martin's life, while the seemingly unflappable Dr. Martin swiftly recognizes the tactic and then shrewdly maneuvers around the distraction to get to the business at hand. After some introductory back and forths as each man sizes the other up, Edward makes some confessions. He claims he is actually a demon general inhabiting and using the body of Edward against his will, that its name in its closest human approximation is Nefarious, that he's the one who's actually responsible for all of the murders that Edward was convicted of by slowly and incrementally corrupting the hapless sap over his entire life, that it was he who actually caused Dr. Fisher to cancel his subscription to Mortal Coil Monthly, that he did so deliberately because he knew Dr. Martin would be subbing in for his deceased mentor, and that all of this was done in service to accomplishing one small part of his master's grand plan to undermine and destroy the creation of the enemy, aka God. Dr. Martin counters by stating that would all be pretty impressive, but unfortunately, he's an atheist, much to the extreme aggravation of Nefarious, who can only respond with insult and a complete misrepresentation of what atheism actually is. Dr. Martin then goes on to counter the alleged demon's plan and claims by exposing their inherent logical contradictions, points that Nefarious never really responds to. What commences from this point in the film is a kind of cat-and-mouse power struggle of ideologies between Nefarious and Dr. Martin, where Nefarious boasts that before the competency interview is over, regardless of the outcome,
Before you leave here today, you will have committed 3 murders.
Dr. Martin of course scoffs at this,
I don't think so.
and then the games begin. And this is where the film's writing, despite a few bright moments, ultimately lets the viewer down and exposes itself for what it really is. The characters of Dr. Martin and Nefarious are written as mouthpieces for what are ostensibly the filmmakers' versions of the progressive left and the conservative right. Dr. Martin espouses the virtues of logic, reason, scientific methodology, societal progress, and personal accountability. He references the great strides that have been made in individual and societal enrichment, education, social acceptance, and global awareness. In fact, this particular depiction of Martin with his dialogue is so on brand for the right that I half expected Nefarious to crack a woke left joke. Nefarious then attempts to counter all of Dr. Martin's salient points by referencing a bunch of cherry-picked statistics regarding global education, sex trafficking, modern slavery, and abortion, essentially rattling off every Christian conservative and alt-right talking point that we have heard beat to death over the past 4 years over on Fox News. And all of this while the audience would think that an entity that claims that it's been alive since creation and doesn't have beliefs but has knowledge would understand simple concepts like the composition division and Texas sharpshooter fallacies. And that's what sets up the entire grand scope of the film and the religious terror that Steve Deese and the filmmakers are trying to sell to their targeted audience. That evil isn't easily discernible by its sinister laugh, its black hat, or its twirled mustache. And that it doesn't deal in grand, sweeping, and blatant actions.
Oh, hell, let's just do what we always do. Hijack some nuclear weapons and hold the world hostage.
But instead is insidiously methodical and devastatingly patient. That it nickels and dimes humans, bleeding them slowly until, before they can even realize what's happened, they're already condemned. And all of that while simultaneously playing to every single base desire of humanity and their inevitable destruction by fostering all of the talking points of the left via mass media. It's basically the overarching plot of the X-Files, but instead of the shadowy government syndicate, you've got demons. But what's trippiest of all is that this film, which essentially amounts amounts to nothing more than a conservative Christian ideological circle jerk, is delivered fairly well by the strong and dedicated performances of its two leads. Belfi deftly rides the trajectory of Dr. Martin's staunch atheist, faced with a growing sense that this all might actually be real, his rational mind encountering what he never could have anticipated. But despite his performance, the filmmakers ultimately drop the ball here in Dr. Martin's dialogue, which is unfortunately impeded by the personal agendas of the writers. An example of this is when Nefarious openly admits that demons don't actually care one iota about humans, but that the business of corrupting humans is nothing more than a means to hurt God by destroying its creation. But Dr. Martin, who previously points out that God is both omniscient and omnipotent, a claim which Nefarious begrudgingly concedes, never follows through by pointing out the broken logic of attempting to hurt an omnipotent entity by destroying its creation, when it's logically entailed by the agreed upon attributes of the God that everything occurring within the creation is within its omniscient awareness and its omnipotent control. If their God is omniscient and omnipotent, then it logically follows that their God was completely aware of this entire demon conspiracy from even before creation, and thus the circumstances that would allow for this conspiratorial action to happen were deliberately created. And it's especially annoying when each character strides boldly up to the line of addressing the logical or evidential problem of evil, but then, for some unforeseen reason, never actually takes the plunge, obviously because such a discussion would ultimately defeat the filmmaker's agenda. Nonetheless, Belfi turns in a really strong performance, giving us a dedicated, focused, and intelligent character who gives as good as he gets. The standout here, however, is Flannery's dual performance as both the demon Nefarious and his hapless meat suit Edward. While Nefarious's dialogue could have been copy-pasted from any Rupert Murdoch-controlled teleprompter, Flannery manages to deliver it with strength, intelligence, and nuance. With every line oozing with malevolent narcissism, Nefarious's sadistic arrogance is tempered only by the fact that everything hinges on a major gamble, that Dr. Martin will eventually be convinced to willingly do what Nefarious needs him to do, and that is to spread his dark gospel, a demonic version of the Bible, to the world in exchange for the phenomenal position and power Old Scratch will deliver to him in reward.
Free will, it is a bitch.
One thing I'd really like to commend Flannery on is his mastery of the physical in his performance, utilizing classic neurological, facial, and body tics that he also showcased in his strong performances in Detox, The Damned Thing, and his episode of Criminal Minds. It's a brilliant actor choice and serves as an excellent visual tactic for the audience to discern when it is Nefarious or Edward behind the wheel. And, contrasting his malevolence, the moments where Nefarious allows Edward to come out to speak are soaked in confusion, desperation, self-loathing, and abject terror. Overall, it's excellent acting, which is sadly undermined by a script that just simply refuses to be intellectually honest. But really, what more would you expect from a film where satisfying the demands of the brand is more important than a cohesive narrative that challenges the audience? Most of the time, this dishonesty is exposed when Nefarious quote drops in its various attempts to sound wise or profound, such as when Nefarious quotes from Act 4, Scene 3 of Shakespeare's Macbeth.
Each new morn, new widows howl, new infants cry, new insults slap the face of heaven.
Internally casting himself as the victimized Macduff and God as the tyrannical Macbeth, he completely misrepresents the conversation between Macduff and Malcolm in the play, which is ultimately about courage and loyalty to one's country in the face of encroaching tyranny, because the conversation is actually an extension of the themes that were expressed in Scene 2, which is context that is deliberately ignored. And when Nefarious mockingly throws Aleister Crowley's Law of Thelema at Dr. Martin,
Do what thou wilt. That shall be the whole of the law.
it's complete and utter cherry-picking because he leaves out the second and third precepts of the law, which acknowledge the preciousness of people, not imposing one's will on others, and the overall importance of love. But the worst of this is each time Nefarious points out that James has committed one of his predicted murders. The first being the assisted life termination of his terminally ill mother, the second being the abortion that his girlfriend is scheduled to have right at that particular moment, and the third being that of Edward himself, who, if Nefarious Nefarious is successful in goading Dr. Martin and condemning him to the electric chair, will die unjustly because he was never actually responsible for the crimes that he was charged with. And every single time that this occurs, the writers never allowed Dr. Martin to point out the very obvious broken logic in each one. When his mother is thrown at him, Dr. Martin indicates that she was suffering from persistent agony, and the act was not only compassionate, but was also something that she herself indicated she wanted. And while Nefarious muses aloud that maybe his sizable inheritance had something to do with his decision to go along with it, he fails to actually counter Dr. Martin's compassionate reasoning that needless suffering is akin to torture. When the abortion is thrown at him, Dr. Martin concedes that he would like to be a father someday, but ultimately it's her choice if she wants to have one. Nefarious can only counter this with twisted emotional appeals that serve to position Dr. Martin's personal feelings over his girlfriend's bodily autonomy. And lastly is the death of Edward himself, condemned to die for actions that he did not willfully commit. But Dr. Martin, having no evidence to indicate the truth of this possession, is therefore ethically and morally bound to do his job. Nefarious condemns Dr. Martin for these things, despite the biblical contradictions that while God is supposedly all-loving, but will allow for boundless protracted suffering, but that's okay because God is sovereign and prolonging human agony is irrelevant in the face of some lesson it's attempting to convey, that God advocates for and has rules for abortion while also establishing the position of women as subservient to the decisions and feelings of men, and that the laws binding Dr. Martin are imposed by a government that is supposedly instituted upon the land by God itself. And the writers never give Dr. Martin the opportunity to point out that if humans have free will, which Nefarious later indicates that they do, then by definition their choices are their own. Terminally ill patients must be found mentally competent by a professional before they can give their legal consent for assisted life-ending measures. Abortions are performed, sometimes even in the most extreme medical situations, only with the express consent of the patient, and even Edward's own death is orchestrated by Nefarious through the deceptive withholding of critical information from Dr. Martin. Because if Dr. Martin actually knew the truth, which he expressly invited Nefarious to give him earlier in the film,
Go ahead. Inhabit me. You have my complete, unfettered, and irrevocable permission. Here I am. What are you waiting for?
then Nefarious' entire plan would be wrecked. In each one of these cases, the culpability of Dr. Martin is completely fabricated. But according to Nefarious' logic, Dr. Martin's inability, unwillingness, or even his ignorance make him equally as guilty as his mother, his girlfriend, and even Nefarious itself. Which implies that every human being on the planet is equally guilty for the actions of every other human being, which not only violates the tenets of free will, but also squarely moves this god into the category of moral monster. Which of course is a road the filmmakers wouldn't even dream of acknowledging, let alone walk down. Really, when boiled down to a fundamental concept, all of this conveys the distinctly Christian idea that humans are inherently worthless, that our agency and reasoning are completely irrelevant, and that we just have to bow down and accept that our inconsequential lives are solely at the mercy of grander forces in the universe. It's the oldest trick in the Christian snake oil manual, convincing people they have a problem that they cannot fix themselves and then selling them the solution. And all for the low price of a weekly offering, accepting a promise that they cannot demonstrate actually exists, and of course complete and total submission to the group. But of course the biggest snafu of all comes in the film's climax. While the desperate Edward is being strapped into the electric chair, a manner of death deliberately chosen by Nefarious as one last method of torturing Edward before the eternal weenie roast, Nefarious takes control one last time and uses his last words to request if Dr. Martin will comply with spreading his dark gospel.
What's your answer, James? Do you accept my master's offer?
To which Dr. Martin silently declines. So then Edward Wayne Brady, in a particularly graphic display, rides the lightning and is no more. But then, in dramatic fashion, while Edward's smoking corpse is being checked for vital signs, Dr. Martin literally hears a sinister voice tell him that he should have taken the offer.
You should have accepted my offer, James.
and then he completely loses control as Nefarious jumps into him and takes over his body, the obvious consequence of his earlier invitation to do so. Using Dr. Martin's body against his will, Nefarious then grabs a gun from the holster of a nearby police officer, proceeds to wave it around the room, forcing people to back away from him, and then aims it under his chin to ostensibly turn himself into a hashtag. But Dr. Martin, still in control of his mental faculties, then pleads to God for help before he pulls the trigger and click. The gun miraculously fails to fire. And here is where the filmmakers betrayed their misunderstanding of the biggest atheist argument against them. Throughout the entire film, Dr. Martin is unconvinced of the truth of Edward's claim of possession. Everything that Edward says can be rationally explained, Edward makes no real logical argument to defend himself, and there is never any actual evidence given to indicate the truth of the proposed state of affairs. In short, Dr. Martin has no rational reason to believe that anything supernatural is going on. That is until Nefarious literally possesses his body and tries to forcibly against his will turn him into a trending topic. The demon's action actually counts as evidence that everything that's being proposed is real. While it may not be strong enough evidence to convince everyone else in the room, it certainly would be strong enough to convince Dr. Martin himself. Something that Dr. Martin expressed from the near beginning of the film that he was open to being given. Ultimately, it's a choice that was made in the script to convey something really dramatic, but what the screenwriters failed to realize is that it also confirms the validity of atheists asking for evidence and not being convinced of the truth of a claim until such evidence is presented. As expected, Dr. Martin then goes on to become a believer and then goes on to edit the dark gospel that Nefarious left him into a novel warning the rest of the world about the dangers and reality of demonic possession. The novel written by Steve Deese. The entire affair, once you dig just underneath the surface, is as convoluted and riddled with contradictions as the Bible itself, indicating that the film's target audience is really only those who already believe in such mythological nonsense. Ultimately, while the film Nefarious does boast some strong performances, competent direction, and some pretty inspired cinematography, the failure to fire here is in its philosophically bankrupt and intellectually dishonest writing, which sadly reduces what could have been an intriguing and challenging psychological thriller that leaves the audience with deeper questions and the chance to engage the piece from both sides of the argument into a puff piece to market Steve Deese's book while gaining ground for the extreme Christian right in their entirely imagined battle with the progressive left. I will, however, give the film some credit for being entertaining, at least at a surface level, and for being an excellent contemporary example of how any creative medium or genre can be co-opted to push an agenda. It's a film that, once completely deconstructed, exposes that it's not the titular villain, but the fundamentalist Christian minds behind the film that are truly nefarious. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. A link on how you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you love scary movies, be sure to check out me and my filmmaker friends over at the Week in Horror podcast, now in our 5th season. Everything you need to become a channel member here, nab yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear, get your own official Darth, Dawkins, Squeak toy, or support the podcast is down in the description below. Once again, thank you all so much for your continued support, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.
Parson, atom stultus es, ut non comprehendias. Continuendum est.
Thanks very much for coming out.